By the time I turned onto her parents' street in Canada, the sleet had started again. That particular Ottawa sleet that can't decide whether it's rain or snow and ends up being worse than either. Cecilia had fallen asleep somewhere around the Queensway on-ramp, one hand still loosely wrapped around the seatbelt, like she'd been mid-argument with it when she went under. Her boots were still on. She was going to regret that in the morning. I'd been the one who got the call at 10:47, not her roommate, not anyone from the party, me, which, honestly, told me everything I needed to know about how the night had gone. 3 hours earlier, Cecilia had walked into her friend Becca's engagement party in a burgundy wrap dress and immediately looked like the most composed person in the room. I know because I was there. She'd asked me to come the same way she always asked me things, framed as a favor, delivered like I'd already said yes. I need a human shield against open bars and people who ask when it's going to be my turn. I told her that sounded like my worst nightmare. She said, "Perfect. Wear the gray sweater." That was us, I guess. I'm Miles Beauchamp, and Cecilia Okafor had been one of my closest people for going on 4 years. We met through a mutual friend at a trivia night at a pub on Elgin Street, where she'd corrected me on a question about the group of seven and then bought me a beer to soften it, which I thought was backwards, but didn't complain about. We'd been something in each other's lives ever since, the kind of something that didn't have a clean name, and so we never tried to give it one. I knew how she drank her Timbs. Double-double, but only in winter. Iced coffee with oat milk. The second, the temperature hit double digits. I knew she reread the same 3 books every year without admitting it. I knew she laughed too loud at her own jokes, and then covered her face. And that when she was genuinely upset, she got very polite, very careful, and very quiet, like she was holding something that might spill. Tonight she'd been very quiet. The party had started fine. Becca was happy, the restaurant on Preston was nice, and for about 40 minutes, everything was warm and easy. Then a guy named Sebastian arrived. Cecilia had mentioned him twice in passing over the past couple months, which with her was the conversational equivalent of a blinking warning light. He was the kind of guy who arrived slightly late to things so people noticed him come in. Nice suit. Easy confidence. He shook hands with his left hand in his pocket, and somehow made it look intentional instead of rude. He came in with someone, not a colleague, not a cousin, not some ambiguity you could generously interpret. A date. A very deliberate date in a black dress, introduced with the comfortable ease of someone who wanted the introduction to land. Cecilia smiled. She accepted a second glass of wine, then a third. By midnight, she was still technically fine, but I'd known her long enough to read the distinction between fine and okay, and she was firmly in the first category. The drive to her parents' place in Canada took about 25 minutes. She'd slept through all of it. I pulled into the driveway, put the car in park, and sat there for a second listening to the sleet tick against the roof. Then I said her name quietly. She stirred. "Are we there?" "Yeah." She blinked at the house like she was recalibrating where she was in the world. "Did I sleep the whole way?" "From the Queensway." "That's embarrassing." "It's fine." She didn't move to get out, just sat there looking at the house through the sleet-smeared window. The porch light was on. "I'm okay," she said, in a voice that meant she was cataloging the damage and hadn't finished yet. "I know. I didn't expect him to bring someone. I know." She finally looked at me. "You didn't like him." I hadn't said that. I also hadn't said the opposite. "I didn't know him." "You didn't like him," she repeated with the certainty of someone who'd been paying attention to me for 4 years. I didn't answer, which was its own answer. She almost smiled. "Then, didn't. I should go in." I came around and opened her door, which she accepted without arguing, which told me more about the state she was in than anything she'd said. She leaned into me once she was upright, not dramatically, just shifted her weight like I was something solid she was grateful was nearby. The front door opened before we reached the steps. Margaret Okafor had clearly been awake, though I suspected she would have denied it. She was in a cardigan and slippers, and she took one look at her daughter and did that particular thing that mothers do where they absorb the whole situation without requiring an explanation and simply step aside. "Oh, sweetheart," she said softly. Cecilia made a small, tired sound that wasn't quite a word. Then Margaret looked at me. Her expression shifted, just slightly, just enough. She lowered her voice in a way that felt like she'd been carrying something for a while and had simply decided, standing here at midnight, that it was time to set it down. You know, she said quietly, you're really all she talks about. I went still, not visibly, I hope. I kept moving, kept my hand steady at Cecilia's back. But something in me stopped completely. Margaret's face was kind and knowing and entirely unrepentant. I probably shouldn't have said that. No, I said, and then didn't finish the sentence because I genuinely wasn't sure how it ended. Cecilia hadn't heard, or, if she had, she'd filed it away somewhere to be horrified about later. Can you help me get her upstairs? Margaret asked, already turning toward the staircase. She sleeps better in her own room. Of course. The walk up felt strange. Not bad, just heightened like the air pressure had changed and I was the only one who'd noticed. The family photos along the staircase wall. Cecilia at maybe 8 years old in a canoe somewhere in Muskoka squinting at the camera. Her parents at Niagara Falls. A Christmas card photo where everyone was wearing matching plaid and she was very clearly suppressing laughter. I'd seen these photos a dozen times. Tonight they felt new. Her room was at the end of the hall, same as always. I helped her sit on the edge of the bed. She looked up at me with that loose, unguarded expression that only appears when someone is too tired or too hurt to arrange their face into anything managed. Miles, yeah, I'm sorry you had to come get me. You don't need to apologize for that. I know, I'm doing it anyway. A pause. Thank you. You're welcome. She was quiet for a moment. Then, why is he like that? I didn't ask who, I don't know. He texted me last week. Her voice had gone careful, just casually, like nothing. Like there wasn't a reason I hadn't texted back. What did he say? Asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime, like it was nothing. She almost said yes, because I'm apparently terrible at this. You're not terrible at it, Miles. She looked up. I almost said yes. You didn't. Only because you were sitting next to me when the text came in and I didn't want to have that conversation. I didn't know what to do with that information, so I held it and said nothing. Margaret came back then with a glass of water and 2 Advil, which seemed to break the seal of the moment just enough for us both to breathe. She handed them to Cecilia and gave me the kind of quiet, sideways look that I had learned, over 4 years, meant she was deciding something. Would you mind staying a few minutes while I put the kettle on? She asked. Sure. When she left, Cecilia swallowed the Advil without argument, which was how I knew she was genuinely done for the night. She normally had opinions about medication timing. Then she lay back against the pillows and closed her eyes. I should have let it rest. The smart thing, the clean thing, would have been to sit in the chair by the window and scroll my phone and wait for the kettle. But Margaret had said something in that doorway that had got underneath everything and was still moving around, and I couldn't leave it alone. Can I ask you something? Cecilia's eyes stayed closed. Probably the Sebastian thing. How long was that going on? A pause. It wasn't really going on, that's sort of the problem. She exhaled slowly. We hung out a few times. He seemed interested, or I thought he did. I think I wanted him to be. Why him? She was quiet for a moment. Because he was there, and he was fine. And I kept thinking, okay, this could be something. Maybe this is what I'm supposed to be doing. Her voice was getting slower, softer. But it never quite clicked, and I couldn't figure out if that was him or me. Something about the way she said it made me careful. And now? Now I think it was me. She opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling. I've been doing this thing, Miles, for a while, where I meet someone and I spend the whole time sort of measuring it against something else. Against what? She didn't answer right away. Against what, see? She turned her head to look at me. And with the soft, tired, uncensored honesty of someone who was 3 glasses of wine past her usual defenses, she said, against how it feels when I'm just with you. The room didn't change. The sleet was still going outside. The old heating system in the Okafor house made its usual sounds. Everything was physically the same, but something had shifted anyway, quiet and irreversible, like ice giving way in late March when you haven't been watching for it. See? You don't have to say anything. Her eyes had closed again. I know it's probably too much. I'm tired of pretending I don't do that. Compare, I mean. It's not fair to anyone. It's not too much, Miles. It isn't. She didn't respond. A minute later, her breathing slowed into something close to sleep. Margaret appeared in the doorway with 2 mugs and nodded toward the hallway, with the quiet authority of someone who had been running this household for 30 years and did not require input. I followed her downstairs. The kitchen was warm the way it always was, under cabinet lights, a fridge covered in old photos and coupons, and a magnet from the ferry to Pelee Island. I'd sat at this table during snowstorms and playoff games and a Sunday dinner, when the oven had caught a small amount of fire. It felt familiar, and tonight felt nothing like any of those times. Margaret set a mug in front of me, Earl Grey. She sat across with her own and wrapped both hands around it and looked at me in a way that was direct without being unkind. "She's been carrying this for a long time," she said. "Not a question." "I didn't know." "I know you didn't." She tilted her head slightly, "Or you knew a little and found that easier." That landed hard enough that I didn't argue with it. She went on, without cruelty. "She went out with a man last spring, the one before Sebastien. Accountant. Perfectly nice. She came home from their third date, sat in that chair you're in, and said word for word, 'He's kind, and he's funny.' And every time he talked about his day, I kept thinking about how Miles would have told the same story." Margaret paused. She wasn't even sad about it. She just said it like it was a fact she'd got tired of arguing with. I looked at the table. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty," she said. "I'm telling you because tomorrow she's going to wake up and remember bits and pieces of tonight and try very hard to walk all of it back. Cecilia is. She's brave about most things. But not about this. Why not about this?" Margaret considered that. "Because she thinks it's the one she can't afford to lose. So she holds it very carefully and pretends it weighs nothing." She met my eyes. "Which means, if you don't mean what I think you mean, you should let her tidy it up in the morning. Let her make it a joke. She's good at that." I sat with that for a moment. "And if I do mean it?" Margaret looked at me steadily. "Then I'd suggest you still be here when she wakes up." I stayed. Margaret showed me to the guest room, second door past the linen closet. Same navy duvet that had been there since at least 2019, and I lay on top of it fully dressed, shoes on the floor, staring at the ceiling while the sleet shifted to actual snow sometime after 1 in the morning. The house was the kind of quiet that doesn't calm you, the kind that takes every thought you've been managing all evening and gives it room to pace. I thought about the trivia night on Elgin Street. I thought about the winter she got a bad diagnosis that turned out to be nothing, but was terrifying for 11 days, and how she'd called me from the hospital parking lot and just talked for an hour about unrelated things because she needed to hear a normal voice. I thought about the way she'd looked in the burgundy dress tonight before everything went sideways. I thought about every time over the past 4 years I'd told myself I was being reasonable by staying quiet. I thought about the word measured, about how she'd used it so casually, like it was a small confession instead of a large one. Sometime around 2, I heard the floorboards in the hall, soft, careful steps. Then a pause outside my door, a light knock. I was up before she'd finished knocking. Cecilia was standing in the hallway, in an oversized Carlton sweatshirt and wool socks, hair loose, arms folded over herself the way she did when she felt exposed. She looked at me for a second without saying anything. Then, "Please tell me I dreamed the part where I said something I can't take back." "Which part specifically?" She closed her eyes. "Right. You're not sure what you said." "I'm sure I said something. The details are patchy." She opened her eyes. "The bits I do remember are enough to make me want to go back to sleep until February." Cecilia. "I said something about measuring, didn't I?" "You did." She pressed one hand to her forehead and breathed out slowly. "I'm going to need you to tell me I was just venting." "I'm not going to tell you that." She looked up at me. "Because you weren't," I said. She searched my face with the expression of someone who desperately wants to find a reason to laugh this off and isn't finding one. "Miles, I was 3 glasses in. You were honest. That's a very generous interpretation. It's what I watched happen." She unfolded her arms, then refolded them, then looked down the hallway like she was considering whether the exit was still an option. "Did I ruin it?" The question was so quiet I almost didn't hear it. "No." She looked at me. "You don't have to." "See, no." I said it clearly, not to be kind, but because it was true. "You didn't ruin it. You said the part we've both been pretending wasn't there." Something moved across her face. "Hope? Maybe." Trying not to be obvious about itself. "Both," she repeated. "Both." She was very still for a moment. How long? Long enough that it stopped feeling like a problem and started feeling like weather. like something I just factored in. She absorbed that. That is extremely Canadian of you. I thought it was mature. It's avoidant. Yes. She laughed once, soft and involuntary, and then it faded because the real thing was still there waiting. So what happens now? I'd been thinking about that. Now I ask you properly, dinner this weekend. On purpose. Not a favor, not a rescue operation, not a mutual shield against other people's milestones. I met her eyes. Just us, doing the thing we've been doing for 4 years, except with fewer pretenses. She was quiet for a long moment. You know, she said finally, for someone who apparently spent 4 years treating this like weather, that's a pretty good sentence. I had time to think it through. When? Lying on your mother's guest duvet for 2 hours listening to it snow. That got a real smile. The one that broke through. The one that made me understand why I'd been in trouble about this since a Tuesday night trivia at a pub on Elgin Street. Okay, she said. Okay. Saturday. Dinner. A pause. Somewhere that isn't a chain and isn't too loud. I want to actually be able to hear you. I know a place. She reached out then and tucked her hand into mine, not dramatically, not as punctuation, just quietly and with the ease of something that had been waiting for permission. I held it. My mother told you something, she said. It wasn't a question. At the door. She nodded slowly. I figured. A pause. Was she smug about it? She was measured? She was absolutely smug. She was measured and smug. Cecilia laughed again, quieter. Then she looked at our hands and back at me, and her expression settled into something more serious. I'm sorry it took Sebastian being an idiot for me to finally say it. I'm sorry it took me 2 hours on a Navy duvet to have the same conversation with myself. We're both terrible at this. We really are. She was quiet for a beat. Then she rose up and kissed me on the cheek, quick and warm and deliberate, and stepped back. That's the preview, she said, with something in her eyes that I planned to think about for quite some time. Sober. On purpose, noted. She slipped back toward her room. I stood in the hallway for a minute after she disappeared, listening to the snow, and felt like the shape of something had finally sorted itself out. Saturday, I picked her up at 6:30. No weather drama, no rescue operation, no cover story. Just Cecilia opening the door in dark jeans and a camel coat, looking nervous and happy in equal measure, which I had decided was my new favorite thing. Margaret naturally appeared first. She took one look at me, one look at her daughter behind her, and said, "Oh, good. You both figured it out," before I had to say something more embarrassing. Cecilia said, "Mom," in the tone of someone who had expected this and still wasn't prepared for it. Margaret kissed her cheek, looked at me, and added, "The reservation better be somewhere decent." "It's on Bank Street." "Acceptable," she said, and walked away. Dinner was easy in that particular way that means something. Not because we talked about what had happened, not exactly, but because we didn't have to manage anything, didn't have to leave a careful gap around the real subject, didn't have to pretend the last 4 years were just one thing instead of what they'd actually been. We talked about everything and a little of nothing, and she stole a piece of my roasted squash off my plate without asking, and it was exactly like every dinner we'd had before, except we both knew what it was. Driving home, she put her hand on the armrest between us, open, just leaving it there. I put mine over hers somewhere on the 417, and neither of us mentioned it. A month and a half later, she still texted me when something made her laugh. I still drove her home. Her mother still found reasons to say something unnecessary every time I walked through the door. The only real difference was that now, when we sat at that kitchen table in Canada, under cabinet lights on, sleet or snow or cold, clear Ottawa sky outside, neither of us had to decide how to hold what we actually were. We already knew.